Okay, so recording. Sharing the screen. So just confirming everyone can see that okay? So this is the current title of my thesis, a comprehensive analysis of archival sources of the Eastern Kulin languages. So I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. Lauren's already mentioned Wurundjeri country. We are here, well, I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country. I'm very privileged to be working and studying and doing this work with the Wurundjeri community on their country. I've been here for about 20 years. So this is a really great opportunity for me to it's been a very interesting process of going through the early records of the settlement of Melbourne, and I guess learning in much more detail about what the dispossession of those lands and the language actually means for the community locally. So pay my respect to the elders of the Wurundjeri people, and also to any Aboriginal elders who are here today. So moving on, the structure of the talk, just to give you a brief outline, go into the context of where this study is coming from. Then we'll talk a little bit about the nature of the data that we're dealing with. Then a discussion of the methodology that I'll be using, and a couple of case studies of some of the analyses that I've been getting into. So here is this is a map of the language situation of is the languages of Victoria. This is a map produced by the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Languages. We have this is the area that that I'm working with. These are the Eastern Kulin languages. We also have to the further west, the Western Kulin languages out here, and Wadawurrung here to the immediate west of the Melbourne area. So these are the three main languages we're looking at. Wadawurrung, which is the language of the Melbourne area, the northern part of Melbourne, and there's also Bunurong to the south and Dongorong to the north. They're all Parmanyungan languages. So this project came about through the Wurundjeri Wadawurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation. They received funding to produce a dictionary of the Wadawurrung language, which is the language of the Wurundjeri people. And I was invited to come on as a full-time researcher for this project to assist in doing the background research necessary to produce the dictionary. As part of the project, we have a steering committee of elders from the corporation, and we have regular meetings with them. Stephen Morey is my principal supervisor, and began a lot of this work, instigated a lot of the work as background to this project. So just a brief outline of the project. In order to produce the dictionary, we need to reconstruct as much as possible of Eastern Kulin linguistic structure, including historical relationships with other languages in the area, phonology, morphosyntax, and the lexicon. Why are we doing this? Primarily, of course, it's actually due to the request from the community. So they have requested that this work be done, and this is a great opportunity to repatriate and decolonize the archival records that we're using to make these records accessible. And of course, there is also value for linguists and the academy in general in this study. So a lot of this work, I'm also heavily indebted to Professor Barry Blake, who's also joined us today. So he's done an enormous amount of work in this area. So I'm really pleased that he was able to join us today as well. Before I get stuck into the data, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the people who provided this information to begin with. Unfortunately, the nature of the data that we're dealing with, primarily written documents from the 19th century, extremely hazy on the metadata. So we don't know a hell of a lot about all the important things like who, what, where, and when of a lot of these documents. We do have some of that information for a lot of them, but not for all of them. So I just wanted to briefly discuss some of these people. These are some of the most important 19th century leaders of the Wurundjeri people. We've got in the middle, at the top, we have Derrimut, who was an important chief when Europeans first came to Melbourne. We have Billy Bellary at the bottom there. That's a sketch made by William Thomas. On the left, we have Simon Wonga. These photos were taken in 1866 at Corranderk. And on the right, we have William Barrack. So many of you will be aware William Barrack is an incredibly important figure in the history of, well, and the culture and the legacy of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. And I really wanted to make sure we paid special tribute to him. In fact, he's a really central figure to the whole entire history of the documentation of the Woiwurrung language in Melbourne. One of an important document that I came across in the course of this study was a very, very early mention of William Barrack by George Langhorne, who was an early missionary in Melbourne in the 1830s. And we came across this entry in his journal. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is from the 10th of December, 1838, where he mentions that the Black Boys, Kalkalo and Barrack, gave him some information about the Curlew, the name of the Curlew, and cultural beliefs surrounding the Curlew. And so that's his name up there. So this is from 10th of December, 1838. So it's very unusual that we've got this specific date. We don't often have that much detail. But over 120 years later, Barrack's descendants were able to tell Louise Hercus more information, memories that they had of words and other cultural information that William Barrack told to them as children. So his legacy sort of spans the centuries. So I just wanted to make a special mention of William Barrack here. Before we get on to the recorders, so I'll be referring to these men as the recorders. They are primarily men. So these are the 19th century gentlemen that wrote down the Eastern Kulin languages. I won't go through all of them by name here, but the central figure that we'll come across a bit is William Thomas, and we'll be discussing some of his recordings today. So moving on to discussion of the data itself. So all these 19th century documents, they're dispersed. They're throughout in various archives throughout Australia, in various libraries. Some of them are quite hard to access. Some of them are not well catalogued. So I've had to actually dig around, and I've discovered a few interesting little bits and pieces that weren't otherwise catalogued very well. Some of them, there's a couple of things that have turned up in the UK. There was one very important set of documents that have turned up in an archive in South Africa that I'll mention briefly later on as well. So they're not just in Australia, they're all over the place, and they're not easy to find. So they're all written documents with the exception of Louise Hercus' Louise Hercus's recordings in the 1960s. She did record some elders who had some memories of a few dozen words. So generally speaking, these recorders were very unreliable. Linguistics was a young science at the time, but none of them really seemed to have, well, very few of them had any understanding of linguistic concepts. And they all had English as a first language, and most of them didn't really seem to have much knowledge of any other language. Not clearly anyway. So we've got a wide range of data. There's a lot of word lists, mostly word lists, but there's also some various phrases and sentences, some longer texts, very few longer texts, and a few dialogues, but not all of them are very reliable for reasons we'll get into. Generally speaking, we've got a huge variety of different orthographies, fairly arbitrary and apparently very inconsistent, even from each individual recorder. There's legibility issues with a lot of documents. There's a lot of contradictions between the documents as well. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Reflecting on this, on the sort of the quantity of data we have. So we're up to about 100 documents now that contain data in the Eastern Kulin languages. And there are a lot of contradictions in there, but it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of languages where the situation seems to be a lot clearer, where there are fewer contradictions, it's partly just because there are fewer records. And so there's just less possibility of contradiction. So that's possibly a good problem to have, as I say there. And unfortunately, very little metadata recorded. So some of our key sources almost never mention who it is that they were talking to. And there's also a big issue is that the names of the languages are often not recorded, or not recorded clearly, not unambiguously. So this is the general issues. I just want to very quickly go through some of the examples of the documents that we're dealing with. This is one of the earliest documents that we've got from George Langhorne, who, as I mentioned, was an early missionary working with Aboriginal people in Victoria. He was only around for a couple of years, but he did make a real effort to try and learn the language. And he was really the first to make any kind of substantial word lists or attempts at grammatical analysis. And William Thomas, who we'll get to in a second, seems to have inherited most of his papers, and also inherited a lot of his strange orthographic habits, but unfortunately wasn't really able to improve on Langhorne's very basic grammatical analysis. So this is probably one of the key discoveries that we've made so far with the documentation, is uncovering George Langhorne's papers that were amongst William Thomas's papers at the Mitchell Library in Sydney. George Robinson was a very important figure in Victoria. He recorded a hell of a lot of word lists from around Victoria, very sort of idiosyncratic handwriting and orthography, and very basically no grammar. He recorded no grammatical analysis at all, just lots and lots of word lists while he was around until the mid 1840s, I believe. This is an example of a page from William Thomas's notebooks. I gave you this one partly because it's got lots of, you'll see that there's a lot of shorthand in here. Now, this is not a particularly, sometimes shorthand does appear in these documents, which could be problematic. This is not a particularly problematic example because most of these words we actually have translations for otherwise, but these appear to be English translations of the language in these documents. And as I'll get to in a second, it turns out that there was actually dozens of competing shorthand systems in 19th century in Australia, and they're not easy to decipher now. So this is actually not a terrible example from Thomas. This is actually fairly legible by his standards. Another important document is this book that was put out by Daniel Bunce in the 1850s from documentation work he did in the 30s and 40s. It's a pretty strange book. You can actually, it used to be available in Melbourne. You could buy it in bookshops and things. I'm not sure if it's still in print at the moment. So it's kind of interesting because he apparently, in order to, he printed a book. He wanted to, I assume, sell this book. In order to make it seem more substantial, he sort of inflated it with masses of English synonyms that are all extremely doubtful, using some pretty strange. There's not too many bad ones in here, but we've got words like beseech and benumbed and belie. It would have been a much shorter book if he hadn't done that. I won't be talking much about Bunce today. This is one of my favorite documents. We haven't, I'm not going to talk about it too much today, but this was something that was uncovered in London. Formerly, it had been attributed to, or a copy of this had been attributed to William Thomas, but I can fairly conclusively prove that it wasn't William Thomas. And I'm referring to this as the Pentridge Lexicon because it seems to have been produced at Pentridge Prison in the 1860s. I'm not going to talk about this one today, but if you're interested, then keep following this project because I'll probably have a lot to say about it later on. Gordon McRae was an interesting man. He was a poet who spent a lot of time with Aboriginal people as a boy, and wrote down lots of words and things with his mother Georgina McRae. And this is an example from a letter that he wrote to an anthropologist in South Africa, Beaker, who and these letters ended up in the archive at Cape Town University. And they've only been sort of recently rediscovered. It's quite interesting. So I'm just going to quickly pause. This is a scan of a page from Howard, who's a very important sort of semi-professional anthropologist. So this is a notebook containing a list of kin terms that, if I've got time for, I'll come back to. So this is a very important document that hasn't really been analysed until now, although it has been transcribed. And this is a sort of fairly typical example of the work of R.H. Matthews. He made lots and lots of sort of verb paradigms and things. He's trying to analyse the grammar. So he did a pretty interesting job of getting a grip of some aspects of verbal morphology. Might come back to him if we've got time. And then in the 1960s, Louise Hercus did some work with some semi-speakers. So that's the gist of the kind of data that I'm working with. And then the secondary sources, I mean, the key works is mostly Professor Barry Blake, who, as I say, I'm very pleased he could make it today. So the most important one there is the paper from 1991 on the Melbourne language, and several others. And also Stephen Morey has done a bit of work as well in the area. So how do I deal with this data? Well, the first these is basically what I need to do. Collect the documents and transcribe them. Now, Stephen Morey has done a lot of this work before, and others have as well. So some of that work had been done. Designing the database, we'll come to that in a bit. Putting the data and as much metadata as we can find into the database, and then doing the analysis. So that's it in a nutshell, how we're doing these things. And what's important for this project, sort of built into it, and an inherent part of this is ongoing community consultation. So regular meetings with the steering committee of elders in order to make sure we're on track and keeping them up to date on what our latest findings are. To go into a bit more detail, I want to talk to you a little bit about a an interesting paper from 1957 from Sylvia Broadbent, the American linguist who was working on Californian languages. So she had a very similar problem. Very quickly, I'll go through this. In various parts of the world, linguistic researchers face the problem that although there are no longer any living speakers of a given language, old vocabulary lists or texts collected by travelers, missionaries, and traders are available. The usefulness of these documents varies widely depending on the training and linguistic background of the collectors. They may be far from the modern standards of phonetic transcription, and phonemicization, if any, is on a strictly intuitive basis. As they stand, such records are quite inadequate for the purposes of the modern linguist. There would be no point in using them if any living speakers existed. So this is my emphasis here, by the way. When all speakers are gone, such documents contain the only information about the particular language that we are ever going to have. We must either devise methods for using them or remain forever in ignorance. And she says, I have worked out a method for extracting from this material as much and as reliable information as it will yield. So this is a situation wherein we've got all these documents from the 19th century. There are no living speakers. The last speakers passed away in the early 20th century. So what was her method? Well, she referred to this as reconstitution. The principle of the method is starting with sound historiographical principles. So a lot of this is to do with handling these primary documents. So make sure you're using primary sources as much as possible. Prioritize the early sources, ideally field notes, if you can get them. And then make sure you do a detailed comparison of different sources. So these are just the general historiographical principles of reconstitution. So let's just have a look at some examples of why. So using primary documents, you can pick up lots of small clues, and this is something that's actually been really, really apparent for me. I'm actually finding a lot of tiny little details that wouldn't turn up in the published versions of these lists, if there are any, and there often aren't. There generally aren't. So here's an example from William Thomas. He would often, when he's writing down language words, he would occasionally, I won't say often, occasionally, with above a double R, he would indicate something with a line or a sort of a squiggly line here. So this is his word for between. There's something there. What does it mean? Does anybody have any suggestions what this could be? Squiggly line? Feel free to jump in. My best guess so far is that it could be indicating a trill, that he's hearing a trill here. So some suggestion that he is recognizing a difference between approximants and trills with erotics. And we know for a fact that William Thomas actually spent time in Spain as a young man, but there's otherwise very little indication that he knew any Spanish. But he might have. Spanish is another language that has a distinction between different types of erotics, so that's a possibility. Another example is this note that I found scrawled on the back of a notebook amongst the papers with this Pentridge lexicon, which I'm otherwise not going to be saying too much about. Can anybody read that, what the penciled note there says? So what I realized this says D like Greek theta. So this is notes from a document from 1861, I think. Now this is an anonymous document. So up until now, I still don't know who wrote this down. This tells me a couple of things, though, looking at this penciled note scrawled on the back of a notebook, that the author recognized some phonetic detail there. So in ancient Greek, theta referred to as far as I'm aware, a voiceless aspirated dental stop. So probably quite similar to what you might hear as a laminodental stop in Australian languages. So they're recognizing something important about the phonetics of the language. And the other important thing for my purposes, for historiographical purposes, is that this tells me something about the author as well. It tells me that the author knew or was familiar with ancient Greek, for example. And that's could be significant in identifying the author of this document later on. And from the same document, we have this. Let me just, so this is, we have dozens of examples, dozens of tokens in the data set of the word for butterfly. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the very few words that actually survived, that actually was passed down to the present day amongst Wurundjeri people. So Bolam is a very well attested word. This is actually, the person who gave this information gave it in 3 different languages, but basically said it was the same word in all 3 languages. And one of those languages is the Melbourne language. And there's a little penciled note here added later, apparently. Bolam means speckled. So this is the only example we've got in all we've got dozens of examples of the word for butterfly, but no explanation of the literal meaning. So in this document, we have this tiny little note that says Bolam means speckled, which may or may not be true. There's reasons to suspect it. This is not an entirely reliable source, but so we'll take that with a pinch of salt. And here's another reason why we need to work with the primary documents. One of the few published word lists was this one from William Thomas. I've given you just one example here. That was published by Robert Brough Smythe in 1878 in a huge book dealing with the Aborigines of Victoria. And we have this for hip, and this is the rendering of the spelling of it. This was published after Thomas's death, by the way. And I'm looking at this, and it seems strange to me. This letter H sort of didn't make any sense to me in the context of this word for hip. So I went through one of the, somebody's got their microphone on. I went through what I thought was an earlier draft of this word list, and I found an example of, I found the original version. This may not have been the draft that was sent to the printers. It might be a separate draft. Thomas wrote heaps and heaps of drafts of these things, and it's clearly a letter T there, which makes a lot more sense. And this word means something like the head of the thigh, literally. So it's good to know at least that it's not just me that struggles with Thomas's handwriting. It's been going on for hundreds of years, well, over a century anyway. So the crux of Broadbent's methodology is paying really close attention to each recorder's phonetic system, looking for internal consistency. So this is what it might not be apparent, particularly with authors like Thomas and Bunce, that there is much consistency, but there actually is if you pay close attention. So once you've figured out that internal consistency, then you can do, you compare forms across word lists from different recorders. So in any given form where sources agree on particular sounds, these are likely to be secure, so you can go with those. And then where they disagree on particular sounds, you can choose the most likely. Some criticism of Broadbent's methodology, which hasn't really been taken up much, to be honest. It's not really mentioned a lot in the literature. It is a bit in America. So Ives Goddard, another Americanist, and Michael Ockrand, I'll put those two together because they're basically saying the same thing. Looking at Broadbent's method, they're saying, yes, this reconstitution is actually very useful, and it can be helpfully applied to these situations, but it's just one technique. You really do need to be, Broadbent's method was really just about word lists. It wasn't about anything more than that, just looking at word lists in a particular language. Goddard and Ockrand mentioned that you need to be comparing it with other languages too, which makes sense. And then Alan Dench, when he spoke about his attempts with reconstituting Nyungar, the language of Southwest and Western Australia, He did apply Broadbent's reconstitution method, but also basically applied the historical linguistics method of comparative method, sort of extending that to the reconstitution situation. So rather than in the normal comparative method, you're comparing reliable word lists of languages that you assume are related, we would be comparing word lists, unreliable word lists of the same language, what we assume to be the same language, and applying the same technique. So that's the approximate methodology. So using all these three methods, reconstitution, comparative method, and what the Americanists, by the way, I should just point out, the Americanists said they really like this term philology. It's not a word that gets used very much in the Australian context, but and you have to be careful with how different writers are using it, because they might be meaning different things. But what Goddard means when he says philology is basically looking at the literature on other related languages and cultures to illuminate what you're trying to reconstitute. So we've got these three different strands, and the other key aspect of my work is applying this to using this in the context of a database. So building a full database and applying computational methods to it. I'm going to just quickly whip through this because I want to get onto the examples before we run out of time. So I inherited a spreadsheet from Stephen Morey of about 9,000 rows. That was where he was at when I started the project. We're now up to about 20,000 rows. That's basically each entry from these 100 documents that we've got so far. Working with them in a spreadsheet format is not satisfactory long term. So we're currently in the process of building a relational database, which I won't go into any detail now because we're running out of time, but there's just a screenshot of one of the tables we've got, which enables us to link tables to have a full relational database. Happy to discuss that in more detail later. So moving on now, I want to just discuss a couple of examples from the data and some of the discoveries that we've found. I wanted to talk about William Thomas a little bit. So he is one of our key sources. He's produced, of those 20,000 entries in our database, he's produced probably about half of them. So he spent a long time. He spent most of his adult life working with and documenting, working with Aboriginal people in Victoria and documenting their languages and their traditional culture. And by most accounts, he was a good man, very well intentioned. But I have to say, after working with his materials, an incredibly frustrating individual. And I think if anybody, I know there are people here who have spent a lot of time working with his materials and can probably sympathize. So he really had the best chance of anyone to really come to grips with the languages, the Eastern Kulin languages, but there's just not much indication that he ever really did. So he apparently just had no ear for phonetics. There's very little phonetic detail and very confusing orthography anyway, and just didn't have the brain for any kind of grammatical analysis. He just struggled for years and years with this. He was literally working on this for 30 years and never really produced anything substantial, but he just kept on writing. So it's quite frustrating. A lot of the his word lists are arguably very useful, but he did also write down a lot of sentences and longer texts that are mostly extremely doubtful. So it's a little bit hard to tell whether he was just writing down these sentences in the best way he knew how. So he just thought it was good enough, or if these were actually sentences that people spoke to him. If it's the latter, then it's apparent that people just didn't have much faith in his ability to understand them. So it's possible that native speakers were just using some kind of pidgin to communicate with him. But some of the words, I was just reading before, some of the words that that Barry Blake has used, I can totally sympathize. I totally agree with his characterizations. Words like disappointing. I think disappointing is the strongest, or is the most appropriate word to describe Thomas's ability with the language, if not practically useless, which is another phrase that Barry used. And here, so this is a quote from Barry Blake, referring to a particularly bad example of a very important document that Thomas produced for the Queen, actually, in language. So it's alarming to read that Thomas acted as an interpreter in court cases, which he did for many years. It would be unsatisfactory enough to omit inflection and use a kind of telegraphese jargon, but to use incorrect inflections and enclitics would have made his attempts at interpretation confusing and of doubtful help for defendants. One wonders what Kulin people must have thought of him. So that's just setting up the situation with Thomas. Incredibly frustrating source. But what's interesting is that every now and again, we come across these really quite amazing little gems of apparently authentic language that maybe he did actually, well, he must have heard from native speakers, or they did actually help him with it. He didn't attempt to analyze them, but he did write them down. So I just wanted to look at a couple of examples. And what we're seeing in these texts that we'll look at, some interesting morphological processes that could be extended for use by a community, for example. So this is a text that is, it's part of a dialogue on the topic of going on a journey, from a document that's known as Book B, that's held at the Mitchell Library in Sydney. So this is a typical example of the kinds of documents we're working with. So yeah, what he's got there now: blackfellows, hold up the pole of the dray, and two of you hold on the back of the cart. And he's got the translation in language there. So this is his original orthography. Now I've transcribed that into a more practical orthography. This is not an official orthography. This is not the orthography that the community wants to use, but this is just for exemplifying purposes. So here's my analysis of it. What I'm particularly interested in is these possessive structures in the noun phrases here. So these two noun phrases here. So this is a kind of structure that R.H. Matthews was the only one to really talk about, but we have very few examples in the database. And so this is one that really stuck out to me that I wanted to just quickly talk about. So we've got the word gut for cart, and galk is the word for stick or pole, or sometimes bone. So this is well attested. Cart is obviously a loan word, and what we've got is if we follow Matthew's analysis, and based on Barry Blake's interpretation of that analysis, what we've got is a genitive on cart and the possessive on stick, and that gives us dray pole. So dray is a kind of cart. And then here we've got something similar. You two hold on the back of the cart. So we've got mum, and this is a very well attested word in languages of Southeastern Australia. Mum means bum or backside, and we also see it extended to be used for the backside of anything. So how I've analysed this, we've got mum, and then the locative ut, which is also fairly well attested, although not by Matthews, interestingly, and the third singular possessive, and then we've got gut as well, and another possibly genitive ending. You can see I've got question marks there because they seem to be different forms. So, and I'm not quite sure why that would be. Let me just discuss how I've come to that analysis. So all the supporting documents. So this is what Matthews had to say about, this is what he said about Tongarong, but he did say that Woiwurrung and Bunurong have the same declension of nouns and adjectives, so, and other parts of speech. So this is what we've been, this is the only sort of substantial document from the early days on the grammar of these languages. So he's got a man's boomerang and a woman's yamstick. He's got this ending that Blake has referred to as the genitive, so I'm following that. And then we've got the possessives here on the head noun. So so that seems to be very similar to what we have in this example. Only difference is that the forms are quite different. So we don't have al, and in fact, there's no clear examples beyond this single example. These two examples in Matthews, we don't have any other examples in the database of that particular form of the genitive. So I'm going to quickly whip on. We've got a few more examples of some more complex noun phrases. So this is a sentence about bridle and saddle. So we've got, in my analysis of it, so Thomas has glossed Warong Kurito as bridle. Now here's my analysis of the form of this. So we've got Wurrung, which is the word for lip, very well attested. We've got locative, again, quite well attested. This is a nominalizer, which it certainly appears in other Kulin languages. We haven't really, there hasn't been any discussion of this in the literature for Eastern Kulin, but certainly Barry Blake has identified it in Western Kulin languages, followed by the third singular possessive. So my gloss of that is, so the bridle is the thing that goes in its mouth. And this is, and then again, in the same sentence, we've got saddle, which is the same structure. We've got the back, and then the locative, the nominalizer, and the third singular possessive, the thing that goes on its back. So this is a really interesting morphological process that that native speakers, apparently, I'm sure this wasn't Thomas that came up with this, because he just was not capable of this level of analysis. This is a strategy for coining new words. There's another example there from the same sentence. I won't discuss that one. So we are really running out of time. I might just very quickly. So this is another some more support. So from R.H. Matthews, this is from one of his notebooks from that same paper on the Tongarong language. He seems to have, alongside the Tongarong forms which were published, these ones here, and this is for the phrase "at my back," crossed out behind me. He's got these other forms here, which appear to be probably the Woiwurrung forms. So here's my transcription of them. I'm going to leave aside the first person one because it looks like maybe there's a missing letter or two in that one, but the other ones are fairly clear. So Matthews didn't analyze these at all, but he did say that these prepositions allowed for inflection. So here's here's my analysis. So it's literally, it is literally at your back. So he did have that, and he crossed it out at thy back, and then replaced with behind thee. So, but it is literally at thy back. So back plus a locative plus second person possessive there. And behind him is the same thing with the third person. And then we have, so Louise Hercus's, in her Wemba Wemba dictionary, she has very similar forms for Wemba Wemba. And also Matthews had very similar terms for Jajala dialect of Wergaya. but notice that there's no, so we've got the word for back, and she's glossed a very similar form for behind for use with possessive markers to form adverbs, but there doesn't seem to be a locative component in these ones. So I might, because we're running out of time, I'm going to skip through all the rest of it. I did sort of want to talk about these other, maybe this is kind of an interesting example of the kind of variety that we find in fairly widespread, well-attested forms, but just an incredible variety based on arbitrary orthographies and mishearings and all sorts of things. But I did want to, if I had time, I would discuss the morphology of this word, the word for white man, which is actually very, and the etymology is actually also very interesting, but I think we're running out of time. And also just very briefly wanted to mention the analysis of the Stephen Morey's transcription of this list of kinship terms from Howard. I've analysed all these terms and made my own sort of idiosyncratic table of kinship structure, just so I can figure out how it works. I don't have time to go into it, but this allows us to see clearly that what the kinship structure that we have here is known as an Omaha structure, where we've got it's a classificatory system, patrilineal moieties, which we knew about. Parallel cousins are the same as siblings in terms of kin terms, and we've got generational skewing of the terms for cross cousins. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that in detail, but that will be another topic for another day. So yeah, we've got some things that I expect to get out of this. So there's a lot of historiographical stuff. So a lot of sorting through the metadata for a lot of the documents for the language. Hopefully I'm going to be able to disambiguate a lot of these word lists, and particularly using computational methods to hopefully come to grips with the kinds of variation that we're finding, dialectal variation that we're finding in these word lists. And yeah, a lot more work on the morphology of the language, morphosyntax. We've got pretty limited expectations on sort of wider syntax stuff because of the nature of the data. And yeah, developing a really robust database model. I think, I've got a bit of an outline of the thesis, very, very rough, and a bit of a timeline. So this is what I'm hoping to achieve, making archival data accessible to community and amenable to linguistic analysis, extend the current linguistic understanding of the Eastern Kulin languages, including the development of a dictionary for community use. So that's where I'm at. I think I'll stop sharing now and maybe open it up to questions. I'll stop the recording now, actually.
Thank you, Andrew. There are lots of